A horse stumbles in the desert. A man hits the ground the wrong way. And in an instant, a Hollywood set goes completely silent. Everyone hears it. The crew, the director, even the biggest movie star in the world standing just a few feet away. A stuntman is dead, not in a scene, not for the camera, but for real. What happened next wasn't a lawsuit, or a press conference, or a public apology. It was something far quieter, and far more terrifying for the studio involved. Because when the widow was offered a number that barely covered a used car, one man decided that standard practice wasn't good enough, and the consequences of that decision would follow Hollywood for decades. The man on the ground wasn't an extra. He wasn't new. He wasn't careless. Pete Keller had been doing stunts for more than a decade, the kind of guy studios trusted when a scene couldn't go wrong. He coordinated the risks, doubled the stars, and made dangerous moments look effortless. On that October day in 1966, he was doing exactly what he'd done hundreds of times before. Until the horse landed wrong, and everything stopped. It happened fast, but not so fast that no one understood what they were seeing. The sound carried across the desert. People didn't scream. They didn't rush in. They just knew. Medics checked anyway, hoping for something to fix, something to reverse. There was nothing. At 38 years old, Pete Keller was gone, lying in the dirt of Monument Valley while a multi-million-dollar production stood frozen around him. This was a major studio film, packed with stars, money, and expectations. Sets could be rebuilt. Schedules could be adjusted. Scenes could be rewritten. But there was no protocol for the quiet afterward. The cameras shut down. The sheriff took statements. The death was ruled accidental. And just like that, the machine prepared to move on. Because this is the part Hollywood rarely talks about. Stuntmen exist to absorb the danger so the stars don't have to. They fall, burn, crash, and sometimes don't get back up. It's understood. It's normalized. And most of the time, it's brushed aside as the risk of the job. But this time, the risk didn't disappear when the crew went back to their hotel rooms. And while the set went quiet, another process had already begun. One that would reduce a man's life to a single number, typed neatly on a piece of paper. Linda Keller was 34 years old when the studio knocked on her door. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. 6 hours earlier, someone had called to tell her husband wasn't coming home. Now a man in a suit was sitting at her kitchen table, speaking calmly, like this was just another appointment on his schedule. He didn't rush. He offered condolences. He said Pete had been a valued member of the production. Then he slid a set of papers across the table and pointed to a number. $5,000. That was the offer. Sign here, and a check would arrive in 2 weeks. It was presented as generosity, not liability, not responsibility, just goodwill. The kind of goodwill that came with a deadline. 48 hours. Take it or leave it. Pete knew the risks, she was told. This sort of thing happened. The studio didn't legally owe anything at all. Linda stared at the number, trying to make it make sense. 15 years of dangerous work. A mortgage. 3 kids still young enough to ask when their dad was coming back. $5,000 to close the file and move on. She needed the money. She couldn't afford not to. But signing felt like agreeing that Pete's life had been worth less than a new car. When the man stood up and left, the house felt even quieter than before. The papers stayed on the table, unsigned. And as the clock on that deadline started ticking down, Linda wasn't the only one who couldn't stop thinking about that number. This story isn't really about John Wayne. It's about a moment when the system did exactly what it was designed to do. Minimize loss, reduce responsibility, and move on as fast as possible. $5,000. A deadline. A signature line. Case closed. And then one person refused to accept that version of the ending. Wayne didn't change Hollywood. Stuntmen were still replaceable. Studios still protected themselves first. But in one private moment, power was used differently. Not for image. Not for applause. Just to stop something unfair from being quietly buried. Nothing brought Pete Keller back. Nothing erased the risk that took his life. But his family wasn't left behind. They weren't forced to trade dignity for survival. And that happened because someone decided that standard practice wasn't the same as doing the right thing. That's the part worth remembering. Not the money, not the fame, but the choice. Because history isn't shaped by what people are allowed to do. It's shaped by what they decide not to ignore when it would be easier to look away. 48 hours after the lawyer left, the papers were still sitting on Linda Keller's table. The clock was running out. The house felt smaller by the hour. Every option in front of her felt wrong. Then someone knocked. She opened the door expecting pressure. Another reminder. Another explanation of why $5,000 was reasonable. Instead, she found John Wayne standing there alone. No entourage. No studio badge. Just the face everyone in America recognized, looking uncomfortable and serious. Inside, he didn't take control of the room. He didn't talk like a star. He sat down, folded his hands, and told her he was sorry about Pete. Not in a polished way. Not rehearsed. Just direct. Then he mentioned the offer. The number. And said plainly that it was an insult. Wayne reached into his jacket and placed an envelope on the table. Inside was $50,000. His money. Not connected to Universal. Not tied to any agreement. No deadline attached. Linda told him she couldn't take it. That he didn't owe her anything. Wayne shook his head. Pete died doing the work Wayne no longer could. That made it personal. That made it his responsibility. But before Linda could even process that moment, Wayne slid something else across the table. A handwritten phone number. He told her it belonged to the studio head. Then he said one last thing before standing up. "This isn't over." And with that, he walked out, leaving the studio about to face a problem it never expected. That afternoon, John Wayne made the call himself. No assistants. No lawyers speaking for him. Just a direct line to the top of the studio that had already decided this was over. The conversation didn't start loud. Wayne didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. He laid out the facts the way he saw them. A man died making one of their pictures. That man left behind a wife and 3 kids. And the studio's answer was $5,000 and a deadline. The studio head pushed back. Insurance. Policy. Accidental death. Standard procedure. Wayne let him finish. Then he cut through all of it. He wasn't interested in what was legal. He was interested in what was right. Pete Keller worked for them. He died on their set. His family deserved more than a handshake and a quiet payout. Then Wayne said what he wanted. A monthly payment to Linda Keller for the rest of her life. Enough to keep a roof over her head. And full college funds for all 3 children. No conditions. No expiration dates. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The cost was mentioned. Wayne didn't argue the number. He made the leverage clear instead. Every picture he owed them. Every future project. He was willing to walk away from all of it. The line went quiet. And for the first time, the studio had to decide whether $5,000 was worth losing the biggest star they had. The silence on the line wasn't confusion. It was calculation. The studio head already knew the numbers. John Wayne wasn't just a star. He was the business. His films brought in millions. Losing him wouldn't be symbolic. It would be expensive. A lifetime stipend for one widow was nothing compared to that. The answer came without ceremony. The studio agreed. Monthly payments to Linda Keller. College funds for all 3 children. Fully covered. But Wayne wasn't finished yet. He demanded everything in writing. Contracts. Legal guarantees. Something that couldn't quietly disappear once the headlines faded or once he was gone. By the following Monday, the paperwork was done. Not because the studio had changed its values, but because it had been forced to. The same system that offered $5,000 had now committed to decades of responsibility. Not out of compassion, but because someone with real leverage refused to let it go. Nothing could undo what had happened on that desert set. Pete Keller wasn't coming back. But the machine that tried to erase him had been stopped. And the real impact of that decision wouldn't be felt right away. It would unfold slowly, month by month, year after year. 6 weeks later, the first check arrived. $500. Then another the next month. And the next. Always on time. No explanations. No reminders. Just proof that the promise had been locked in. It wasn't a fortune, but it changed everything. The payments covered most of the mortgage. The $50,000 Wayne had left behind filled in the gaps. Food, clothes, school supplies, the quiet costs that pile up when a family loses its anchor. Linda didn't have to sell the house. She didn't have to uproot her kids in the middle of grief. Life didn't suddenly become easy. She took a part-time job. She raised 3 children on her own. She learned how to carry loss without letting it swallow the future. The stipend wasn't something she ever took lightly. Every month, it was a reminder that someone had stepped in when the system was ready to move on. Years passed. The kids grew up. One became a teacher. One an engineer. One a doctor. Every tuition bill was covered. Every semester paid for by the same studio that once thought $5,000 was enough. And while Hollywood kept making movies, that quiet decision followed this family for decades, shaping lives in ways no one on that set in 1966 could have imagined. Nearly 40 years later, a letter arrived at the John Wayne estate. It wasn't from a studio executive or a fan club. It was from one of the children who had lived that story. Sarah Keller was grown now, a history teacher, old enough to fully understand what had happened to her family, and what almost did. She wrote about the day her father died. About the man in the suit who offered $5,000 and a deadline. About her mother sitting at that kitchen table with no good options left. And then about the day John Wayne knocked on their door and changed the direction of their lives without ever asking for credit. The checks came every month for 37 years, right up until her mother passed away. They kept the house. They paid for college. They gave her family stability when it mattered most. Wayne never turned it into a headline. He never told the story himself. Sarah ended the letter with something simple. Power, she wrote, doesn't mean much unless it's used when no one is watching. Her father died making movies. But one man made sure his family didn't disappear with him. Today, that letter sits in a museum. Not as a monument to fame, but as quiet proof of a choice that mattered. This story isn't really about John Wayne. It's about a moment when the system did exactly what it was designed to do. Minimize loss, reduce responsibility, and move on as fast as possible. $5,000. A deadline. A signature line. Case closed. And then one person refused to accept that version of the ending. Wayne didn't change Hollywood. Stuntmen were still replaceable. Studios still protected themselves first. But in one private moment, power was used differently. Not for image. Not for applause. Just to stop something unfair from being quietly buried. Nothing brought Pete Keller back. Nothing erased the risk that took his life. But his family wasn't left behind. They weren't forced to trade dignity for survival. And that happened because someone decided that standard practice wasn't the same as doing the right thing. That's the part worth remembering. Not the money, not the fame, but the choice. Because history isn't shaped by what people are allowed to do. It's shaped by what they decide not to ignore when it would be easier to look away.